Throughout the medieval era, many factors determined how successful a king was. For instance, if a ruler was successful in warfare, he was guaranteed to be remembered as a great medieval king. In addition, if a king was pious or deeply religious, he was also considered a success. Speaking out against a senior religious figure would have been almost on par with blasphemy. These medieval kings fit the criteria, and that is why they have made the shortlist of the greatest medieval kings of all time. Richard I of England, better known as Richard the Lionheart, was King of England for just 10 years, from 1189 to 99. Yet he is still one of the most famous medieval kings of all time. Born on the 8th of September 1157, Richard was the eldest surviving son of Henry II of England and his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine. During his early childhood, Eleanor and Henry had become estranged from one another, and as a result, Richard spent the majority of his early years in France with his mother. Richard spoke French and became accustomed to French culture. In 1172, he was made Duke of Aquitaine and became acquainted with the French heir to the throne, Philip Augustus. By 1180, Philip had been crowned as King Philip II of France, and just 7 years later, the pair's friendship would be put through a serious test: the onset of the Third Crusade. Richard was the first European noble to take the cross, a term given to those who had given their crusading vows to recover Jerusalem for Christendom and take it out of the Muslim Saladin's hands. However, Richard was unable to go out on crusade as soon as he wanted to. His father had died, and Richard was thus crowned as King Richard I of England, which delayed his crusading journey. He did not actually set out on crusade until July 1190, 10 months after his coronation as King of England. Both Richard and Philip set out on crusade together. Two huge medieval kings going to fight for their countries was a sight admired by many in both England and France. Richard also made important alliances across Europe on his way to the Holy Land, something pivotal to the success of any medieval king. Arguably the most important was his marriage to Berengaria of Navarre in Cyprus in May 1191. She was the daughter of King Sancho VI of Navarre. Upon arriving on the coast of Acre, Richard took part in the famous Siege of Acre, recapturing the coastal city for the Crusaders. However, he never managed to recapture Jerusalem. Yet this does not mean that this crusade was not a success. The Treaty of Jaffa, which Richard signed with Saladin on the 2nd of September 1192, ensured that Christians would be granted safe access to Jerusalem, and granted all territory between Jaffa and Tyre. They may not have captured Jerusalem, but they captured huge amounts of important territory. Richard was later captured by Henry VI, the Holy Roman Emperor, on his way back from the Holy Land, and imprisoned in Trifles Castle in Germany between December 1192 and February 1194. Fortunately, in his absence, Richard had promoted Hubert Walter, a royal advisor, to Archbishop of Canterbury, and he ran England smoothly, even quashing a rebellion from Richard's younger brother John. Walter also managed to raise 100,000 marks, enough to pay Richard's ransom. Richard returned to England in March 1194 and forgave John for his rebellions. However, he did not stick around and was back on the continent by June of the same year. Unfortunately for Richard, just 5 years later, he was shot by an arrow in France. The wound became gangrenous, and he died on the 6th of April, 1199. Richard's legacy as a king is certainly one of a crusader, rather than an English king. He may have been King of England, but that was in name only. He only spent 6 months of his 10-year reign in England. Richard definitely deserves a place on this list, as he achieved far more in warfare and territory terms than many of his predecessors, who are also regarded as good kings, did, such as William I, Yar, 1066-88, and Henry II, Uriar, 1154-89. Moreover, Richard's reign was a period of relative peace with Scotland, something many of his successors failed to achieve. Louis IX of France is the only king on this list who was canonized. He was canonized by Pope Boniface VIII in 1297 and was the only French monarch to become a saint. He is often regarded as the ideal Christian monarch, born on the 25th of April, 1214 near Paris, Louis was the son of King Louis VIII of France, also known as Louis the Lion, and his wife, Blanche of Castile, who was a daughter of King Alfonso VIII of Castile. Louis was only 2 years old when his grandfather, Philip II, died, and only 12 when his father died. He was crowned that same year, and it is thought that his deeply religious nature came from his mother, who, while ruling in his minority, was reported to have told him, "I would rather see you dead at my feet than that you should ever commit a mortal sin." It is thought that Louis started ruling in his own right by about 1234, which was when he married Margaret of Provence. It was also at this time that Louis's mother became jealous and tried to keep the couple apart as much as possible. However, this was not very successful, as the couple reportedly had a happy marriage, producing 11 children together. The main feature of Louis's reign was that he was heavily involved in crusading, going on 2 separate crusades, the 7th Crusade in 1248 and the 8th Crusade in 1270. The former was a disaster for the crusading movement. Arriving in Egypt in early June 1249, the Crusaders began their campaign with the capture of the port of Damietta. Unfortunately, the Ayyubid Sultanate knew the territory much better than the Crusaders, and the seasonal rising of the Nile River and scorching hot summer temperatures made it impossible for the Crusaders to advance. However, on 8th February 1250, Louis lost the Battle of Al-Mansura, where he was captured by the Egyptians. His release was negotiated, and he spent the following 4 years in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It was during this period that Louis used his wealth to help rebuild the Crusader states, which had been damaged by previous crusading ventures. In addition, he also conducted diplomatic missions with Islamic representatives. He returned to France in the spring of 1254. Throughout the late 1240s and 1250s, Louis was in contact with the Mongol Khans, including Guyuk Khan, a grandson of the legendary Mongol leader Genghis Khan. On the 24th of March 1267, at a parliament held in Paris, Louis and his 3 sons took the cross to set out on the 8th Crusade. The Crusaders arrived at Carthage on the 17th of July, 1270, but disease had already broken out in the camp. Louis himself died of dysentery on the 25th of August 1270. St. Louis certainly deserves a place on this list. He was the only French king to be canonized, and his pious nature did not stop him from going on a crusade. It is also important to note that success in warfare does not necessarily denote a successful medieval king. Louis was the epitome of a Christian medieval king. You may be forgiven for thinking you have not heard of Robert I of Scotland, but that is because he is much better known as Robert the Bruce. Robert's claim to the throne came from the fact he was the 4th great-grandson of King David the Poix of Scotland, 1124-53, and his claim came about during the period of Scottish history known as the Great Cause, when Margaret, the Maid of Norway, had died aged just 6 in 1290, and there was no direct heir to the Scottish throne. Bruce had been heavily involved in the First War of Scottish Independence against England, which had been raging on since the English invasion of Scotland in 1296. Initially, the war had been fought with William Wallace, known as Braveheart, until his capture and eventual execution by King Edward the Martyr of England, who was known as the Hammer of the Scots. After submitting to Edward the Wars in 1302, Robert Bruce inherited his family's claim to the throne upon his father's death, but moved quickly and seized the throne for himself in 1306. He was shortly after defeated by Edward the Marne's forces at the Battle of Methven in 1306 and was forced to go into hiding. However, this did not last for long. Edward the Wine died a year later and was succeeded by his militarily incompetent son, Edward II. Bruce re-emerged from hiding and soundly defeated English forces at the Battle of Loudon Hill on the 10th of May, 1307. This was just the beginning of Bruce's victories against the English. However, it was not until 1314 that Bruce really established himself as a true Scottish national hero and one of the greatest medieval kings of all time. Facing a far numerically superior English force at Bannockburn on 24th of June 1314, Bruce's force of approximately 6,000 soldiers was up against Edward II's army of $20,000. Something had to go in his favor. the Scottish forces successfully forced the English army back into the Bannock Stream, where many of them drowned in their heavy armor. The result was a disaster for Edward II, but a huge morale boost for Scottish forces and Bruce. In 1320, the Declaration of Arbroath was submitted to Pope John XXIV, which acknowledged Robert as King Robert X of Scotland, king of an independent kingdom. 2 years later, Bruce raided England again and defeated English forces at the Battle of Byland Abbey. This was a turning point in Scottish warfare, as they had formally surpassed the English with their military techniques. They had ditched the traditional warhorse for more foot soldiers, resulting in a quicker and more efficient victory. By 1324, Pope John XXIII had acknowledged Robert as King of Scotland and Scotland as an independent kingdom. Edward II died a broken man in 1327 after being deposed in favor of his son, Edward III. The new king recognized Robert's independence and concluded it in the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328 by renouncing all claims over Scotland. Robert the Bruce died the following year to be succeeded by his son, King David II. Not only is Robert the Wise recognized as one of Scotland's greatest medieval kings, or greatest king in fact, but he is generally recognized as one of the greatest medieval kings of all time. To this day, he is still regarded as a Scottish national hero and has been portrayed in numerous books, films, and stage adaptations.